I would just like to say again what a pleasure and an honor it is to be with you all here, with these distinguished scholars. And I would like to thank once again our friends, Turkad, especially Jamal Nur Sargut, for their remarkable hospitality and kindness. One of the most memorable encounters in the history of Sufism is surely the first meeting of Şems-i Tebrizi and Mevlana Jalaluddin Rumi. Although there are numerous versions of the story of this encounter, probably the most important account is the one that Şems himself recorded in his discourses or maqalat, where he says that he spoke as follows to Rumi. The first thing I spoke about with him was this: how is it that Beyazıd did not need to follow the example of the Prophet and did not say, "Glory be to thee," or "We worship thee"? And Rumi completely understood the full implications of the problem and where it came from and where it was leading to. It made him inebriated, intoxicated on account of his purity of spirit, for his spirit was pure and cleansed, and it shone within him. I realized the sweetness of this question from his intoxication, though I had previously been unaware of its sweetness. Franklin Lewis, who has analyzed this passage at length in his excellent book on Rumi, has provided a persuasive interpretation of the way that both Şems and Rumi followed the Prophet, unlike Beyazıd Bestami. Şems, according to Lewis, returns again to this question of following the Prophet, and the case of Beyazıd apparently provided the touchstone by which Şems could gauge the inner orientation of others and test whether a fancy for mystical speculation or indulgence in antinomian behavior outweighed a person's love and respect for the spiritual attainment of the Prophet. And let me stop and just observe that antinomian means the idea that you are beyond the law and you do not have to follow the commandments of the law or the Sharia. Lewis is certainly correct in pointing to the central importance of the concept of following the Prophet, mutaba'at, in the mystical thought of Şems-i Tebrizi. Omid Safi has discussed the likelihood that Şems even criticized Muhyiddin ibn Arabi for insufficiently demonstrating this quality. Yet I must confess that it has always seemed to me there was something more to say about this episode. Perhaps it's the occurrence of the word intoxication or drunkenness, sukr, which Şems uses twice to describe the reaction of Rumi to the example of Beyazıd. And let me make a remark outside of the paper in response to a question from our friend, Professor Moinuddin. It is interesting that Mevlana in the Divan-i Şems and in the Masnavi has a very positive portrayal of Beyazıd Bestami and his remarkable sayings. And I think the difference is that the maqalat of Şems is a series of notes about conversations that took place with individuals that we unfortunately don't know exactly who was present. And it was a different kind of audience than Rumi had in his poetry, where, as in the case of Fariduddin Attar and his poetry, examples of Beyazıd and Hallaj formed a marvelous example for the understanding of fana, the states of annihilation, and other important topics. So it's a different kind of audience, a different kind of literature, a different kind of exposition. Because Mevlana and Şems are not like jurists, qazis, who give fatwas about people. They speak according to the audience. The appearance of this kind of intoxication suggests there is some excess. There is some excess or overplus of meaning that does not quite fit into the conventional notion of devotion to the example of the Prophet. Despite the fact that Şems criticizes Beyazıd on a number of occasions, one retains a lingering suspicion that there was something about the boldness of Beyazıd's ecstatic claims and the audacity of his statements that called forth a response of equal audacity from Şems-i Tebrizi himself. Lewis is quite aware that most Sufis would have been able to explain the sayings of Beyazıd as ecstatic sayings or shathiyat. which should not necessarily be taken at face value or condemned as blasphemous insults against God or the Prophet. He adds that other Sufi scholars were critical of the ecstatic expressions of Beyazıd and Hallaj, which they explained away as the products of intoxication that could be safely disregarded. Yet, as previously mentioned, it's striking that Şems described Rumi's reaction to this question as also being a kind of intoxication or sukr. Does that mean Rumi's reaction was also invalid? Or was he responding to a deeper meaning in Beyazıd's expressions? These questions require further exploration. It's well known that outrageous expressions like Beyazıd's "Glory be to me, Subhani," or Hallaj's even more startling phrase, "I am the truth, Ana al-Haq," have often been classified as shathiyat or ecstatic sayings. It's important to point out that these sayings are not necessarily to be dismissed as the ravings of lunatics, though there are undoubtedly some who hold that opinion. But to the contrary, there is abundant evidence to indicate that these ecstatic sayings have often been considered to be deep and profound mystical insights, or the results of such insights, which unfortunately cannot be understood by the ordinary person. It's noteworthy that an authority of the stature of Junayd composed a commentary on the ecstatic expressions of Beyazıd, which has fortunately been preserved for us by the early Sufi scholar Abu Nasr al-Siraj al-Tusi in his book of glimmerings on Sufism, the Kitab al-Luma' fi at-Tasawwuf. Notice the title that Siraj gave to this section: "The Commentary on Ecstatic Expressions and Words that are Externally Found Repulsive, though they are internally correct and well-founded." While it is true that Siraj had to debate with the theologian Ibn Salim, who objected to Beyazıd's sayings, Siraj argued that his opponents had understood the words of Beyazıd in an overly literal manner, but these ecstatic expressions require that one know the inner knowledge and experience that gave depth and substance to otherwise strange expressions. Indeed, Siraj refers to Junayd's commentary as a tafsir, a word normally used for commentaries on the Quran. Other interpreters like Abu Hamid al-Ghazali basically accepted the validity of the insights expressed in ecstatic sayings, although al-Ghazali was seriously concerned about the possibility of misinterpretation by the less informed listener. Ghazali distinguished two kinds of shath. The first kind consists of what he called broad, extravagant claims made in passionate love of God Most High, in the union that's independent of outward actions, so that some go to the extent of claiming unification, ittihad, rending of the veil, kashf, contemplating a vision of God, ru'ya, and oral conversation with God. Then they say, we were told such and such, and we said such and such. In this they resemble al-Hussein ibn Mansur al-Hallaj, who was crucified for uttering words of this kind, and they quote his saying, I am the truth. An al-Haq. Al-Ghazali goes on to say that this kind of talk is very dangerous to the common people because they lose their chance for salvation if they think that a purified soul that has attained spiritual states can dispense with religious duties. The consequences of such an antinomian interpretation are so severe that Ghazali concludes that the killing of him who utters something of this kind is better in the religion of God than the resurrection of 10 others. The second kind of shat that he describes is that which is unintelligible to the listener, regardless of whether it's merely confused babbling or something which the speaker comprehends but cannot articulate properly. Since this is bound to be interpreted arbitrarily, it is not permissible to express such things publicly. In this exposition, Ghazali's main concern is to prevent ordinary people from being misled by difficult or strange sayings, even though he implicitly regards the genuine kind of shatiyat as valid for those who can understand. In the most mystical sayings, however, he sees a real danger of antinomianism. Other Sufi writers, such as Rusbahan al-Baqli, have given much more extensive, positive interpretations of shatiyat, as we can see from his important commentary on ecstatic sayings, which is available in Arabic and Persian. And it's well to remember Fariduddin Attar, among others, who has given a spirited defense of the sayings of Bayazid. Now, it is true that there are numerous passages in the discourses of Şems-i Tebrizi where he criticizes Bayazid's saying, "Glory be to me, Subhani," for various reasons. As indicated in the first example mentioned, one reason was that Bayazid appeared to be claiming a station beyond that of the Prophet Muhammad, which would be a form of blasphemy. Even if this is a form of intoxication, Şems remarks, it is incompatible with the true following of the Prophet. But this is not the only reason Şems gives for criticizing Bayazid. Şems on other occasions observed that Bayazid did not have the capacity to keep secrets. This is the well-known criticism of having a shallow cup, tang zarfi, which certain Sufis use to indicate the limited spiritual capacity of their predecessors or contemporary rivals. Thus, Şems remarks as follows: "These saints and perfect ones to whom the world pays respect also have a veil, and that is sometimes they relate their secrets with God in order not to be destroyed. At other times they do not have this veil. I tell secrets, but I do not make a speech. It's a wonder of these saints when speech appears." Bayazid does not belong to this tribe of saints. They are the prophets and messengers. Perhaps if they became intoxicated from this speech, they would be unable to drink. Not even 100,000 barrels of wine can do what the speech of the Lord of the worlds can do. So revealing the secret, ifsha asir, is a charge that could be laid against Bayazid precisely because it was unlike the behavior of the Prophet. Şems does not stop here, however. On a number of occasions, he goes out of his way to say negative things about the spiritual status of Bayazid. Şems even uses the story of Bayazid's prediction of the future appearance of the great Sufi Abul Hasan al-Kharaqani to point out his imperfections. Finally, he says, they do not hold Bayazid to be one of the perfect saints. One sincere dervish went to his tomb, Bayazid's tomb, placed his finger on his mouth in astonishment, and said, "Ah, between this dervish and God, a veil has remained." This Bayazid passed by the village of Kharaqan, and he said, "After 150 years, a man will come out of this village who will be 5 degrees beyond me," and so it was. At the very time, Abul Hasan al-Kharaqani became a disciple and put on a dervish cloak by his tomb. The point is not only that a sensitive visitor to Bayazid's tomb could still detect the presence of his spiritual veil, but also that Bayazid would be surpassed by Kharaqani. More substantially, Şems responds to a well-known story according to which Bayazid refused to eat melons because he has seen no evidence about how the Prophet used to eat melons. This was often taken to be a sign of Bayazid's deep devotion to the Prophet. Şems, however, poured scorn upon this story. "They say," he says, "that Bayazid did not eat melons. He claimed, I have never found out in what manner the Prophet, peace be upon him, ate melon. But following of the Prophet is both superficial and meaningful. You have observed the superficial aspect of following. But how is it that you fail to observe the truth and meaning of following? As the chosen one, Muhammad, God's blessing upon him, says, 'Glory be to thee, Subhanaka. We have not worshipped thee as it befits thee.' As Bayazid says, 'Glory be to me, Subhani. How great is my station.' If someone supposed his station to be greater than the station of the chosen one, he is a real idiot and ignoramus." So it would seem there is good reason to think that Şems was focused upon the problem of Bayazid failing to follow the Prophet adequately. Nevertheless, there is a whole class of other remarks by Şems-i Tebrizi concerning Bayazid, which is harder to explain. Many of these statements have a bold and audacious character that clearly falls into the category of acts of boasting and one-upmanship, which are indeed important characteristics of ecstatic sayings or shathiyat. We can find the rhetorical basis for this audacity in the ancient boasting contest of the pre-Islamic Arabs. In fact, the early Sufi author Abu Najib as-Sohrawardi corroborates this connection in his widely used manual of conduct for Sufi novices, Adab al-Muridin. In the lengthy section on dispensations, rojas, or possible deviations from the rules, Sohrawardi says the following: among the dispensations are boasting and publicizing one's claim to spiritual states. In this matter, their standard is that one should intend to publicize the bounties of God who is exalted above it. As the Quran says, indeed, speak of the bounty of your Lord. That is permissible in the raptures of a spiritual state, hal, or in a boasting contest, mufakhara, with an adversary. This is precisely the same sort of phenomenon that we see in the shatiyat contests of the saints, when one outrageous statement is done by the next. Ruzbahan concludes, this action is from the jealousy of gnosis, and jealousy is an attribute of God. This wrangling munaqara of the prophets and saints is exemplary sunnah. Shams Tabrizi was in fact familiar with this type of boasting contest, as he indicates in the following story. He said, two mystics were having a boasting contest, mufakhara, and a debate with each other about secrets of mystical knowledge and the stations of the mystics. I think these were qalandars, as you will see. One said, a person who comes along sitting on a donkey, to me that person is God. The other one said, to me, the donkey is God. In short, they tried to outdo each other by force. With Beyazıd and others, in their words, it's clear that it's not like this. But to spend time on their sayings is a veil for this reason that it is something else. Someone said, what is that something else? I said, for example, you heard these words of mine, they become cold in your heart. That veil becomes something like this. They are near to incarnationism, hulul. The words of the spirituals are, we dwelt in a single body. This is halaj. How will you comprehend that you are full of desire? Although the example that Shams gave of these dervishes in a boasting contest is a ridiculous one, it nevertheless provided him with an opportunity to imply that there are others like Beyazıd who are different from the foolish pair depicted here. One may conclude from this that Shams considered the sayings of Beyazıd to be serious and important consequences of a spiritual state, but at the same time he was concerned about how words can be misinterpreted and become a veil. His concluding remarks in this passage quote an excerpt from a famous poem by Hallaj, arguing that it could be the source of an antinomian misinterpretation by those who consider themselves to be spirituals. But there's something else hidden in the criticism of Beyazıd by Shams. The fact is that Beyazıd held a singular position in as the preeminent early Sufi known for shatiyat. From an early date, Sufis who were contemporary with Beyazıd engaged in boasting contests with him in the form of their own ecstatic expressions. Vasati said, they all died in delusion up to Beyazıd, and he died in delusion also. Likewise, Shibli said, if Abu Yazid was here, he could become a Muslim with the aid of our children. At a later date, Muhyiddin ibn Arabi also engaged in extensive interpretation of the sayings of Beyazıd, including both praise of Beyazıd and a subtle kind of one-upmanship to indicate his own superiority. Ibn Arabi considered the sayings of Beyazıd as boasting, fakhr, but he maintained that his own statements were not boasting, but were commanded by God. So he made the boast that he made no boast. Subsequently, Sufi thinkers such as Ahmad Sirhindi engaged in the same kind of what I call a rhetoric of transcendental hyperbole to claim a spiritual state that went beyond both Beyazıd and Ibn Arabi. So from this point of view, dramatic criticism of Beyazıd in the form of shat is perfectly compatible with the recognition of his spiritual eminence. Indeed, such spiritual critique in the form of a boasting contest could only be justified in relation to a spiritual master of very high degree. Şems Tabrizi, in some of his remarks, actually insists that Beyazıd must be recognized as a saint of the highest status. Thus, he maintains that even if the famous theologian Fakhr Razi were multiplied 100,000 times, he would not come close to the path of Beyazıd. Şems repeatedly cites examples of Beyazıd's spiritual attainments, including his ability to perceive the true condition of the inhabitants of the graveyard, and he refers to Beyazıd's selfless actions, such as exchanging the merit of his 17 pilgrimages to Mecca in order to give water to a dog. And he performed pilgrimage by circumambulating his sheikh 7 times. Yet, in other observations, Şems is willing to make theatrical denunciations, not only of the supposedly intoxicated Beyazıd, but also even his sober counterpart Junayd. So Şems says, they all speak about Junayd and Beyazıd, but let me say, Junayd and Beyazıd and their words are cold on my heart and appear cool. And in the same breath, he can say, that discussion that occurred yesterday, what place do Beyazıd and Junayd have here? And that Hallaj, who was the shame of his master, has fallen and it's wiped him out. They are not even one hair on the body of the prophet. Şems portrays Beyazıd as giving a pretentious speech in a mosque only to be silenced by a woman who denounces him for making a false spiritual claim. In this way, Şems concludes, Beyazıd cannot endure my presence for 5 days, 1 day, or none. There's no question that Şems-i Tebrizi was deeply devoted to following the example of the prophet, mutaba'at, in a profound manner, and that did lead Şems to find fault with Beyazıd for claiming a spiritual status that seemed to infringe upon the supremacy of the Prophet Muhammad. Yet the attitude of Şems toward Beyazıd was complicated by the rhetoric of boasting that forms part of the tradition of shatiyat, or ecstatic expressions. In this respect, Şems also made boasts in the form of criticisms that included not only Beyazıd, but also the scrupulous and sober Junayd. The audacity of Şems-i Tebrizi was born of the heat of his own spiritual experience, in comparison to which the words of previous mystics were simply cold texts. In short, the audacity of Beyazıd Bestami was outmatched by the sayings that demonstrate the audacity of Şems-i Tebrizi. Teşekkür ederim.